Okay, so someone shared this feeling with us, and it really hit home. They said, I wish life was like a non-contested divorce. Then we could live without the white shadows that keep creating a cycle of pure evil without consequences.
Mm.
And that feeling, right, that really deep yearning for a justice system that isn't weighed down by these inherent biases and where accountability is really clear. Well, that's what we're going to dive into today.
Yeah, that's that desire for a clean break from those cycles of injustice really speaks to a lot of people's frustrations, and it's a great starting point for us as we look at all these complex issues we want to explore with you today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because in this deep dive, we're going to be talking about racial disparities in judicial proceedings, which is a really tough but super important topic to look at.
Mm-hmm.
And for you, what we've done is we've looked at a ton of real criminal cases,
Right.
cases with both black and white defendants, and we focus specifically on the judges who presided over those cases.
Yeah.
And the idea here isn't to oversimplify things or start pointing fingers, but rather to really understand the, incredibly complex web of factors that contribute to these disparities we see.
Right. By looking at specific cases
Exactly.
and by looking at the role that the judge plays in each of these cases, we hope to kind of give you a clearer picture of some of these systemic issues that might be contributing to what we see.
Yeah. And again, we're not dealing in hypotheticals here for you. These are these are real courtrooms, real decisions, and real lives that were impacted by the outcomes. So to unpack this, let's look at our first case, which involves Judge Patricia DeMongo
Okay.
and the experience of a young man named Khalif Browder.
Right. So Judge DeMongo, you might remember her. She was a New York State Supreme Court justice and has become kind of a commentator, legal commentator. And Khalif Browder's story is really stark. He was arrested when he was only 16 years old. He was accused of stealing a backpack. But here's where it gets, really disturbing. He was held in pretrial detention at Rikers Island
Oh, wow.
for almost 3 years.
3 years.
3 years without a conviction.
So, innocent until proven guilty, right?
Right, and that's one of the key takeaways from you, is that the bail system that we have in place can really act as a punishment before someone has even been found guilty of anything. Browder being held for 3 years without a trial at Rikers really shows how devastating pretrial detention can be, especially for young Black individuals like Browder who get caught up in the system.
And for you, this case also highlights those controversies that surround Judge DeMongo, because she has faced criticism from some who feel that her practices actually contributed to this really harsh pretrial environment, the kind that disproportionately impacts young people of color like Browder.
Right.
And there's a real debate, when you look at his case and similar cases, about her overall impact and whether or not there might have been elements of bias at play
Right.
in that system.
Yeah, and if we kind of connect it to the bigger picture for you, the Browder situation really highlights how decisions that are made at different stages of the judicial process, including those made by judges about bail and detention, they can have really profound and lasting effects.
Yeah.
And those effects can disproportionately fall along racial lines.
So Khalif Browder's experience really brings to light those potential issues at the pretrial stage. Now let's move on to a case that triggered a huge debate at the sentencing phase, and it raised these really key questions about how race and privilege might play a role in judicial outcomes.
Right.
This was the case of Judge Aaron Persky and Brock Turner. You might remember this case because it really ignited a firestorm of public outrage.
It really did. So Judge Aaron Persky was a judge in Santa Clara County, and his name became synonymous with sort of a lack of justice after he handed down the sentence in the Brock Turner case back in 2016. You might recall that. So Brock Turner, who was a white male, was convicted of sexually assaulting an unconscious woman. And despite, the seriousness of that crime, Judge Persky gave him a sentence of just 6 months in jail.
Yeah, and for you, what's really interesting here is that immediate and very intense public reaction to that sentencing. A lot of people felt it was incredibly lenient. And that leniency was widely seen as reflecting biases within the system, biases that potentially favor affluent white defendants.
Right.
It really brought the whole idea of privilege and how that might be influencing judicial outcomes to the forefront of the public conversation.
And it did for you, in a big way. The controversy that this case generated was so huge that it led to Judge Persky being recalled from the bench in 2018. So that's like a very real example for you of how public opinion, often shaped by perceptions of racial and socioeconomic bias, can have a tangible impact on a judge's career. And it raises a big question for you, right, about how do we balance judicial independence with public accountability? Because on the one hand, judges need to be able to make impartial decisions, decisions that are based on the law. But cases like Persky's show how much tension there can be when those decisions are perceived as just deeply unjust and potentially influenced by bias.
So we've seen how those issues of pretrial detention and sentencing can sometimes be intertwined with racial disparities.
Mm-hmm.
Let's look at another part of the judicial process where bias might come up, and this is in the interpretation and application of specific laws. And the case that really brings this to light is the case of Marissa Alexander.
Right.
And the Stand Your Ground law. And this takes us to Florida, and we're looking at Judge James Daniel.
Okay, so Judge James Daniel presided over the case of Marissa Alexander. She was a Black woman who was sentenced to, and this is, pretty shocking, 20 years in prison for firing a warning shot.
Oh, wow.
During a domestic violence incident with her estranged husband.
20 years?
20 years for firing a warning shot. That's a fact that I think really deserves closer examination.
Yeah.
And the real issue here, like you were saying, is Florida's Stand Your Ground law and whether or not it's actually applied equally across racial lines.
Yeah, and for you it raises the question, does the law actually protect everyone equally? Or are there these subtle biases that are creeping into how it's applied in different situations?
Right. So Florida's Stand Your Ground law basically says that if you feel threatened, you don't have to try and run away before you use force, like deadly force, to defend yourself. So the controversy here is whether this law is applied fairly to everyone, regardless of their race. And what's, both fascinating and deeply troubling is when you contrast Alexander's case, her sentence, with cases where white defendants who were in similar situations, self-defense situations, received much lighter sentences.
Yeah.
So in that context, Judge Daniel's ruling really amplified for you those concerns that there might be some systemic racial biases at play that are influencing how self-defense is interpreted and applied.
It really brings up for you the issue of judicial discretion. This idea that judges have a certain amount of leeway, like you were saying, in how they rule, how they interpret the law.
Mm-hmm.
And we saw that with, Judge Persky's lenient sentence, Judge Daniel's really harsh sentence.
Right.
It really highlights for you how much leeway they have.
Right.
And the question becomes, is that discretion being applied evenly, or are these biases, whether conscious or unconscious, creeping in and affecting those decisions?
Exactly. It's the nature of judicial discretion. But while, judges are expected to act independently and make those decisions based solely on the law and the facts of each case, there's always this possibility that pressure from outside or their own internal biases might seep in.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and look at a case that got a ton of media attention, the trial of Casey Anthony, which was presided over by Judge Belvin Perry.
Right.
Well, Judge Belvin Perry is known for handling a lot of high-profile criminal cases, and the Casey Anthony trial, the one for the murder of her daughter, Kaylee, really captured the nation's attention.
It was a media circus, for sure. And while Judge Perry wasn't specifically accused of racial bias in this particular case, the dynamics of the case do raise some really interesting points about the whole judicial process.
Yeah, and it's that really intense interplay for you between, how the media portrays things, what public opinion is, and how the judge handles themselves in that environment. So while race wasn't a central issue in the accusations against Anthony, the case still prompted these really big debates about how public sentiment, which is often driven by media coverage, can put pressure on judicial proceedings and the people involved in them.
And it makes you wonder, what are all those unseen influences that might be at play, even in cases where there's not a direct allegation of bias?
Right.
Okay, our next case brings us to some more recent events, and it involves Judge Peter Cahill and the trial of Derek Chauvin. Right, Judge Peter Cahill. So he presided over the trial of Derek Chauvin, the former Minneapolis police officer who was charged with murdering George Floyd. And, this was a case that carried immense weight given all the protests and the call for racial justice and an end to police brutality.
Yeah, and the conviction in this case was seen by a lot of people as this crucial step towards accountability for the death of a black man at the hands of a white police officer.
Right.
And Judge Cahill's role in navigating that really highly charged environment, I mean, that's super important.
Yeah. Yeah, Cahill's rulings throughout that whole trial really highlighted for you the huge pressure that people in his position, judicial figures, can face when they're dealing with cases that are so high profile, cases where society is demanding justice.
Right.
And it showed that very delicate balance that's required between ensuring a fair trial for the defendant and, at the same time, acknowledging the huge public interest in what's going on.
And the potential for a verdict to really impact the larger conversation.
Especially when you're talking about racial disparities in policing.
Yeah. Okay, so after that, we had the case involving Judge Regina Chu and the fatal shooting of Dante Wright.
Yeah, so Judge Regina Chu presided over the trial of Kim Potter, the former police officer who shot and killed Dante Wright, a young black man, during a traffic stop. And again, this case really brought those issues of police accountability and the role of race in judicial outcomes to the forefront of the national conversation.
And for you, this was another case where the way the proceedings were handled was really closely examined. Especially given everything that's going on nationally with the discussions about police violence against black individuals.
Right, and what's really interesting here for you is how these cases, especially those that involve police officers, they often become like flashpoints, reflecting these broader anxieties that society has, and they become these focal points for demands for systemic change within law enforcement and the justice system as a whole. So Judge Chu's decisions, and ultimately the verdict in this case, were very closely watched and debated in that context.
Okay, so our final case study takes us to Texas and involves Judge Tammy Kemp
Okay.
and the trial of Amber Geiger for the murder of Botham Jean.
Right. So Judge Tammy Kemp was the judge in that case, and Amber Geiger was a white police officer who shot and killed Botham Jean, a black man, in his own apartment. And this case brought up some really important questions about how race plays into how we perceive who's the victim, who's accountable, particularly when that perpetrator is a law enforcement officer.
And this case was particularly interesting because of what Judge Kemp did after the sentencing. She showed compassion towards Amber Geiger. She even hugged her and gave her a Bible. And that really sparked a lot of discussion.
Yeah, it did. Judge Kemp's compassionate actions, while, maybe they were intended to offer comfort, they ignited this big debate about potential bias and whether those actions were appropriate for someone in her position, especially in a case with such clear racial elements. And it raised that question for you, is that level of empathy consistently shown across racial lines in our justice system?
So, looking across all these cases, we start to see these patterns, these recurring themes. But it's important to make a distinction here for you between systemic bias and the actions of individual judges.
Right, that's a really crucial point because systemic biases are those historical and deeply ingrained inequities within the legal system itself. It's the laws, the sentencing guidelines, even just societal attitudes that can shape outcomes for all judges, no matter their background.
And then you've got individual bias, which is, I think, maybe what people think of first.
Mm.
But our analysis really shows that even black judges can have biases or can feel that immense pressure from the dominant judicial culture or from public opinion.
It's not just about representation.
Exactly.
It's great to have diverse judges. That's incredibly important. But the system itself can exert pressure and expectations that might end up influencing how decisions are made.
And that kind of leads into those concepts of judicial independence and discretion. Judges have a lot of freedom in how they rule, how they interpret the law. We think back to Judge Persky and his very lenient sentence and Judge Daniels' really hard sentence. It really highlights that for you. How much leeway judges have, and the big question is that discretion being used fairly, or are there these biases, creeping in, whether they're intentional or not, and affecting those decisions?
And speaking of pressure, there can be real consequences for judges who want to stand up against things they see as unethical or biased within their own profession.
Oh, yeah.
It's not an easy thing, speaking out against your peers, especially in a system that's traditionally hierarchical and, often not very diverse. It can be really risky. It can lead to professional isolation, even more formal repercussions. And, black judges in particular might be very aware of how their actions are being perceived within a system that's predominantly white.
Yeah.
And that adds this whole other layer of complexity to their decision-making process.
And it highlights for you that solving these issues is really a collective responsibility.
Right.
It's not just on individual judges.
Exactly. Systemic change needs everyone to work together.
Yeah.
You need judges, but you also need lawmakers, policymakers, and the community as a whole.
Yeah.
And while there are, standards for judicial conduct and oversight bodies, if you really want to dismantle bias, you need a much bigger, broader approach.
And that role of community pressure and representation can't be ignored.
Right.
Judges who are connected to their communities may have a much deeper understanding of the impact their decisions will have.
And, community support is so vital for judges who are trying to challenge the system.
Yeah,
And while it's crucial to have black judges on the bench, that's not the only answer.
exactly.
We have to make sure that those judges, that those diverse judges, are also empowered to make real change and challenge unethical practices without being afraid of what might happen to them.
Yeah, and it seems clear that continuous judicial training and awareness programs are super important here.
Absolutely. Ongoing education, focusing on racial bias, on cultural competency, and on ethical decision making, that's absolutely crucial for all judges.
Hmm.
It means helping them understand those sometimes unconscious cultural dynamics that can influence how they make judgments.
Okay, so wrapping this deep dive up, it seems like the big takeaway is that racial disparities in judicial proceedings, it's not a simple problem with a quick fix.
No.
It's incredibly complex and deeply rooted in systemic biases. And the individual actions and decisions that happen within that system. The cases we've looked at, they really illustrate how these biases can show up and the huge controversies they can cause.
If we go back to that sentiment you started with, that wish for a system that's free from those white shadows that perpetuate injustice, what we've seen today shows just how multifaceted those shadows are. They're not just individual prejudices, they're woven into the very fabric of our legal institutions and our societal norms.
So it's not just about wishing for a clean break.
Right.
We see the real complex work that has to be done to dismantle these deep-seated issues. And so here's a thought for you to consider. Given everything we've discussed, what specific changes, whether they're at the systemic level, the institutional level, or the individual level, do you believe would be most effective in creating a truly equitable justice system?
Yeah.
And maybe even more importantly, what role do you think public awareness and engagement play in actually making that change happen?
Great question.
That's something for you to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back next week with another one.